In mid-March of 1912, about the same time the second pair of Congos were started, Japan began its first of the four battleships meant to complement the four battle cruisers. This was the 29,326-ton Fuso. For fiscal reasons, it wasn't until about a year and a half later that her slightly improved sister, the 29,795-ton Yamashiro, was started. These were essentially battleship versions of the Congo-class battle cruisers. That is to say, they sacrificed machinery and thus speed for heavier armament and armor. The number of main guns carried was increased 50% by adding 2 midship turrets, even though their firing arcs were rather limited. Lacking the technical ability to design heavy guns and mounts themselves, the guns and turrets were the same as on the Congos, only with more armor. The secondary armament remained the same 6-inch case-mated gun. Unfortunately, even with a forecastle deck, the forward pair on each side were too wet. Armor was much thicker, but still on the incremental pattern. They had very little in the way of a TDS. Originally coal-fired, both were modernized between the wars. Despite this, by World War II, the increased weight, combined with the stress put on their hulls by 6 large holes, made them slow, 18 knots, and structurally weak. This was part of the reason neither saw major action during the war until Leyte Gulf, where they were detached from the faster center force. Another reason was the lack of fuel. By now, everyone should be aware that Japan went to war because it needed more oil. Once war started, the need only grew, and there are few things that use oil more than a battleship. The final and main reason, though, was the wait for the Kasen Kantai, the great decisive battle. Following the Russo-Japanese War, it was pretty clear to both sides that the next Pacific War would be between Japan and the U.S. Japan had aspirations to be a military, economic, and industrial world power. The only way it could do this, though, was by controlling access to the breadbasket of China and the resources of the East Indies. The major concern, though, with regard to the U.S., was the Philippines. While not having much in the way of natural resources itself, due to its position, the Philippines forms a natural flank between the East Indies and Japan. Whoever controlled the Philippines could protect or interdict shipping between the East Indies and Japan. The thought of gaining access to the resource-rich East Indies, only to have that access potentially cut off by American ships, subs, and aircraft, was intolerable. The U.S. knew, or at least figured this. The result was Plan Orange, which went through various incarnations throughout the teens, 20s, and 30s. In short, Plan Orange called for the U.S. garrison to hold the Philippines as best as they could once the war started. While the troops were holding out as best they could, reinforcements would sail westward, covered by the U.S. battle fleet, through the Central Pacific. Plan Orange assumed the two fleets would meet somewhere in the western Philippine Sea, and American numerical and technical superiority would rout the Japanese fleet and allow the Philippines to be saved. The Japanese plan, knowing they couldn't match the U.S. numerically, was based on the idea of being individually superior and wearing down the massed U.S. fleet as it crossed the Pacific. Long-ranged land and carrier-based aircraft, along with submarines, would attack the U.S. battle fleet as it crossed the Central Pacific, whittling down its numbers, hence the long-range Zero and Betty. Once the two fleets came in range of each other, their spotter planes would prepare them for battle. The night before the decisive action, destroyers, cruisers, even the battle cruisers, would charge in and under the cover of darkness engage the American battleships at point-blank range in an attempt to whittle its numbers down even more, even if it meant sacrificing themselves. This strategy was the reasoning behind the Japanese development of the Type 93 long-lance torpedo and its obsessive training in night fighting tactics. The next morning, the two battle fleets would engage. With its numbers worn down by constant air and submarine attack, then by the night battle, the two fleets would meet on roughly equal numerical terms. The Japanese fleet would also have the advantage of operating closer to home and thus being fresher. With the U.S. fleet inevitably destroyed in the decisive battle, wink wink, Japan could fortify its defenses to the point that even if support in the U.S. for continuing the war didn't collapse, by the time American industry was able to rebuild its fleet, the Empire could repel any counterattack. Thus was born the concept of the raid on Pearl Harbor, a raid whose goal was to cripple the U.S. fleet long enough for the Philippines and the East Indies to be conquered unopposed and then fortified, while hopefully demoralizing the U.S. enough to stay out of the war. Unfortunately, the Japanese ran into a problem. Namely, due to the ambassador's slow typing speed, their declaration of war was delivered after the attack had begun instead of moments before. Not that a few hours would have made much difference. The result was that a nation that was mostly apathetic to the idea of intervention in world events was suddenly unified in the spirit of revenge for what it saw as an unprovoked surprise attack. Therein lays the irony for Japan. War with the U.S. was assumed inevitable once the decision was made to invade the East Indies, so it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Imperial Japan was a top-down dictatorship, and thus thinking everyone else worked the same way. Since the U.S. president had made statements indicating he supported the U.S. going to war if Japan attacked the East Indies, it was assumed such was the national resolve. It was not. A closer study of American society would have revealed most Americans wanted nothing to do with the European or Asian wars being fought so far from their border. A more measured study would have drawn the conclusion that as long as Japan didn't attack any U.S. territories, perhaps the U.S. wouldn't interfere in their conquest of Asia. After all, if America did nothing about the attacks on Peking, Warsaw, Helsinki, Oslo, Brussels, Amsterdam, Paris, London, Athens, or Moscow, why would it care about Jakarta? In fact, while the Japanese couldn't know so, it was U.S. policy to not fire unless fired on. Without digging too far into the realm of counterfactual, with hindsight, maybe a better plan would have been to dispatch Kido Butai a few days later and go ahead with the invasions of the East Indies on December 7th, sailing right past the Philippines. Only if the U.S. attacked the invasion force or declared war, probably the next day, would the carriers then attack Pearl Harbor. Otherwise, they would turn around and head home. Another interesting alternative is what if instead of making the Western powers, England and the Dutch, an enemy, Japan had joined the war on their side. This was a tactic that had worked very well for them in World War I. The end of 1941 was arguably the lowest point for the Allies. If Japan had come to the table making offers of some kind of lend-lease, it's rather hard to see the British or Dutch churning them down. Especially in the Mediterranean and North Atlantic, the Allies desperately needed more ships. Japan also could have benefited from the technology transfers of such things as radar and sonar. It was not to be, though. The Japanese government, mostly led by the army, would accept no course of action except war, and didn't hesitate to arrest or assassinate any dissenters. Many have speculated that Admiral Yamamoto was given command of the combined fleet to get him away from any would-be assassins. Once the decision for more war was made, even though they knew it was unwinnable, the samurai code, Bushido, wouldn't allow the military leaders to refuse to carry it out to the best of their ability. Samurai don't rebel. They would rather die, by their own hand if need be, than suffer the dishonor of failing to carry out their orders. This, the code of Bushido, was a lie, but I'll deal with that later. Admittedly, though, the idea of bringing the U.S. to the bargaining table by making the continuation of war too unattractive with a great decisive battle was successful. The great decisive battle was to be the invasion of Japan. Even after the obliterations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan was ready to fight on if their terms weren't met. Of course, by this point, the only terms they had left was that the emperor be spared. So, facing casualties in the millions if the Battle of Japan was fought, with or without more A-bombs, the U.S. accepted a conditional surrender. Fuso was started March 11, 1912, and finished November 18, 1915. Yamashiro, was started November 20th, 1913, and finished March 31st, 1917. Main armament was 12 14-inch 45 caliber guns in 6 twin turrets, 2 forward, 2 midship, with the number 3 turret facing forward on Fuso and aft on Yamashiro, and 2 at the stern. Again, these were repeats of the guns on the Congos, so I won't go over them. Secondary armament was 16 6-inch 50 caliber guns, 8 on each side, built into the forecastle deck that ran from the bow all the way to just short of turret 5. The first pair were under the overhang of turret 1. The second pair was under turret 2. The third pair was under the bridge. The fourth pair was under the forward funnel. The fifth pair was under turret 3. The sixth pair was under the rear funnel. The seventh pair was under turret 4. The eighth pair was under the barrels of turret 4. These were the same 6-inch guns as on the Congos. Turretary armament was 12 single open-mounted 3-inch 40 caliber anti-aircraft guns, 6 on each side. Finally, 6 submerged torpedo tubes were fitted, 3 firing off each side. Propulsion was provided by 24 coal-fired boilers venting through 2 funnels. These provided steam to 4 turbines which produced 40,000 horsepower. Each turbine directly drove one of the 4 propellers for a top speed of 23 knots. They had 1 rudder. The lower, or main belt, was 12 inches thick at the waterline, reducing to 4 inches near the bottom, and ran from turret 1 to turret 6. At the rear end, 8 inches protected the steering gear. In front of the belt and behind the steering gear, armor reduced to 4 inches. The upper, or casemate belt, was 8 inches from turret 1 to turret 6, reducing to 6 inches over the secondary casemated guns as it neared the main deck. The armored deck was a combined 1.5 inch over the vitals, thinning to 1/2 inch near the ends, but increasing to 3 inches over the steering gear. Bulkheads 12 inches thick closed off the armored box. Barbette armor was 8 inches. Turret armor was 12 inches on the front, 8 inches on the sides, and 4.5 inches on the top. Conning tower armor was 14 inches on the sides. The boilers were divided into 4 separate rooms. They were double-bottomed. Both were modernized. Between 1917 and 1922, Yamashiro carried an aircraft platform on turret 2. In the mid-20s, as longer and longer range gunfire was accepted, the distinctive thumbnail smoke deflector was added to the forward funnel in an effort to keep smoke out of the increasing number of fire control platforms added to the forward tripod mast. In the 30s, with the treaties and the world economic situation halting new construction, and then Japan's withdrawal from the treaties, both were heavily modernized. Maximum elevation of the main guns was increased to 43 degrees, while the secondaries were increased to 30 degrees. The single 3-inch anti-aircraft guns were replaced with 4 of the new 5-inch 40 caliber anti-aircraft twin mounts midship, 2 on each side. The forwardmost 6-inch casemate guns on each side were removed and the hulls plated over. They were just too wet. The light and medium anti-aircraft was updated and increased. To support spotting at longer ranges, the forward mast was replaced with the distinctive pagoda tower with its many levels. Doing so meant the removal of the forward funnel, leaving them with just one. This in turn was possible due to them being re-engined. All 24 coal-burning boilers and the 4 old turbines were replaced with 6 oil-fired boilers, each in its own compartment by dint of adding a longitudinal bulkhead through the engineering spaces, and 4 new turbines capable of 76,000 horsepower. Combined with lengthening the stern by 25 feet to improve hydrodynamics, this marginally increased speed to 24 3/4 knots. Underwater protection was also increased by the fitting of bulges, which also helped restore lost buoyancy and increased fuel capacity. Deck armor was thickened to 3 3/4 inches over the engine rooms and magazines. The barbettes were thickened to 12 inches. all of the torpedo tubes were removed. A catapult for 3 float planes was added to the quarterdeck on the starboard side. Displacement rose to 34,700 tons, with the exception of adding more light and medium anti-aircraft, along with receiving radar in July of 1943 and again in June and August of 1944. Little more work was done on them. As a result, by the time of the war, they were capable of only about 18 knots, and their hulls were heavily stressed. Both were stationed in Japan at the start of the war and mostly stayed there at first. The only real exception was the Battle of Midway, where they were part of the Aleutians invasion force. In August of 1943, Fuso transferred to Truk, Yamashiro joining her in mid-October, only to return to Japan at the end of the month. At the start of February 1944, Fuso transferred along with most of the fleet to the East Indies, where she would be closer to the oil fields there. In July of 1944, Fuso returned to Japan for refit. Following refit, both arrived in the East Indies in early October. On October 22, 1944, both sailed for the Battle of Leyte Gulf as the core of the slower southern force. As they approached the southern end of Surigao Strait on the morning of the 24th, they were attacked by carrier aircraft. The only real damage they suffered was a bomb hit to Fuso, which destroyed her float planes. Continuing up the strait during the pre-dawn hours of the 25th, a string of ineffective PT boat attacks was followed starting at about 3 a.m. by destroyers. At about 3:10, 2 torpedoes hit Fuso's starboard side. One hit midship, flooding 2 boiler rooms and starting a fire. The other hit near turret 1. With her speed reduced to 10 knots, burning and listing to starboard, she fell out of formation. By about 3:45, the fires reached her magazines and she blew up in an explosion that ripped her in half. About 10 minutes after Fuso, at about 3:20 a.m., Yamashiro was hit portside by 2 torpedoes. Flooding the rear magazines to prevent explosion, her speed reduced to 12 knots, down by the stern, and listening to port, Yamashiro continued north. At about 3:50, she finally came within range of the American battle line and, despite returning fire, began taking hit after hit of not only 5, 6, 8, 14, and 16-inch shells, but also follow-up destroyer torpedo attacks. Totally overwhelmed, at about 4:20 a.m., the burning Yamashiro finally rolled over to port and sank stern first.